Hi, this is another Ask Augustin. Today I'm going to talk about chromatic scales and give some tips about chromatic scales. Chromatic scales can be kind of tricky, but you find them in a lot of different pieces. It's really worth practicing them. And the good thing is, unlike other scales, you can keep reusing the same fingerings no matter what key you're in because they're chromatic. So those techniques that you develop when you practice chromatic scales, you will be able to apply them in a lot of different places in the repertoire. So my favorite fingering for chromatic scales is actually to make a lot of small shifts that are all half-step shifts. So basically I have more problems, but they're like really small problems in these shifts. A different fingering would be to have fewer shifts that are bigger, like. And of course that makes most of it cleaner, but that shift that remains is harder. Sometimes the danger of this fingering is that you can hear like kind of a jolt where that shift is, and that it's not as even, that it can sound a little bit like this. So if you use that fingering, you really want to smooth out that shift, make it very fast, make sure that there's no jolt in the bow, that the bow keeps going without being affected by the left hand, and that all the half steps are exactly the same size. You don't want the half steps where that shift is to be suddenly bigger or smaller. So that's the main danger there. You want the whole chromatic scale always to have a direction. You know, it often gets louder or it gets softer. It has some kind of momentum to it. When you do the other fingering, the one I mentioned in the beginning, where you do more shifts that are really small, I like it because it's easier to get a really even shape to the chromatic scale. But the essential thing about that is that the shifts all have to happen very fast and cleanly. Otherwise it can get kind of mushy. Otherwise it can sound too glissando-like, that you kind of feel like there's all these slides in between. So it needs to be very rapid shifts. Which one you prefer it's a little bit a personal preference. Some people do more these kinds of fingering. I often see them in printed music. I personally have always really felt comfortable with shifting more often, but really small shifts. When you practice chromatic scales, it's important to not always start in the same place. Practice starting in all different places at different tempi, different bowings, just to get to develop your these motions and make them very dependable and a little bit independent of the right arm. An example of some chromatic scales in the repertoire might be in the Bruch concerto in the first movement in the development. There are these chromatic scales. And I like to group the notes a little bit in fours because the orchestra is moving in quarter notes, so I want slightly the four groups, but mostly I want actually a unified direction for the whole thing. This is an example where I use the type of fingering that has more shifts that are really tiny. It allows me to control a little bit more where the emphasis is and make it smooth and give it some direction. I try to do the same thing in the next chromatic scale. I basically want to give the whole chromatic scale a direction towards the top and not have too many jolts in between. And it does take a lot of practice, but as I said, any chromatic scale passage that you practice, you actually learn things that you can then apply in a lot of other pieces where there are chromatic scales, and they do happen fairly often. So I think it's time very well invested. I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you next time.